Hello. This video is going to feature a lecture on the material in Chapter 15 of our textbook. This chapter focuses on evolutionary theory as it can be applied to the area of personality psychology. First up, we'll talk a little bit about the featured psychologist for this chapter, Dr. David Buss. Then we'll discuss an overview of evolutionary theory of personality. Pardon me. Next, we'll talk about some of the related research. And on the screen, you'll notice that I have X'd out the last item titled Dimensions for a Concept of Humanity. Throughout this semester, the material that falls in that area, while it is prominently focused on in the textbook, it will not be prominently focused on in our class. So let's get started. Dr. David Buss, who I have personally met, is an April baby born in the 50s. He does come from a certain level of socioeconomic status privilege, and I think that is important to state in light of the example we used in Chapter 1 of personality traits. And it also is important in terms of this concept that a person's life and their lived experience influences what they subsequently choose to study and how they subsequently choose to study it. So it's important to take a look at his life from all angles. So we know he's a male, we know he's white, we know he comes from a certain amount of socioeconomic status privilege. He earned his PhD in psych in the 80s at UC Berkeley. He is retired and is professor emeritus out of the University of Texas. He has written a lot of articles, a lot of chapters, and a number of books. He even has one of the better selling textbooks in personality psychology, which is ironic as we are not using his textbook for this class, but he is a very prolific author. Okay, a lot of the literature in evolutionary psych as it pertains to personality was written by David Buss or his students. So he has done a lot to advance this area of the literature. So here's a question. What are some major concerns of the evolutionary theoretical approach to personality? This area is newer, and it is a hybrid area. It takes into account personality, trait, and mechanisms. It also takes into account biological psych particularly from this evolutionary perspective. So some of the major concerns of the evolutionary theoretical approach to personality also bridge multiple areas of psychology, because this area itself is a combination of multiple areas. So one of the criticisms of an evolutionary perspective on anything is that it's basically retrospective, because an evolutionary approach is looking at what our ancestors experienced, such that who we are today is basically a direct result of what they went through. Because we're taking that sort of a look at how we got to the place where humanity is right now, it's always retrospective, and it's difficult, I will say, not impossible, but difficult to construct testable hypotheses to test out this theoretical approach, right? Because we can't go back in time and restructure mankind, and we can't go back in time and change the environment that people were going through at the time to see how subsequent generations would turn out. So we can't test those types of things. So a lot of it is speculative and it's retrospective. As noted on the screen, this area is concerned with how various psychological mechanisms present day promoted fitness for our ancestors. So we have to speculate, what were they going through such that those of them that had the traits we have now were able to survive and thrive and pass on their genes, and those of them that did not have these traits that we have now were not able to survive and thrive and pass on their genes. Noted on this screen, evolutionary psych is now grappling with ways to incorporate individual differences and species-typical psychological mechanisms within a unified conceptual framework. Again, it is difficult to imagine what our ancestors experienced. We can speculate, but we can't be absolutely sure, such that it is a struggle to imagine what they experienced, imagine how and why their experiences led them to the place where those of them who had traits like ours were able to survive and thrive and procreate, and those of them who did not have traits like ours were not able to survive and thrive and procreate. So a lot of this area, as you can imagine, focuses on things that can be seen and easily measured. So things like physical traits and physical mechanisms have taken up the majority of the space in the evolutionary theoretical literature. Applying it to personality is a much newer area, and it's much more difficult because what we are studying are things that are not tangible, things that are more difficult to measure. And as a result, those difficulties combined with the difficulties of the speculation of our ancestors' environments really make this field exciting and interesting, but just fraught with a lot of difficulties in terms of measurement. So that's a bit of an explanation for this point that's being made on this slide. Now, some of the major principles of an evolutionary theoretical approach, while Darwin's theory of evolution was not the only one, it is the most often discussed one, and it is the most often referenced one. And certainly it is at the heart of this literature and this area of psychology. So Darwin's theory suggests there are two mechanisms by which species evolve and groups evolve. So the two mechanisms are sexual selection and natural selection, such that I'm sure you've heard the term survival of the fittest. That's kind of an encapsulating term to summarize this concept of natural selection. So basically, our ancestors who had the best physical traits and who had the best psychological traits, emotional traits, etc., the ones that had the best traits that allowed them to survive the physical and social environment, they were the ones who lived. And the ones who were thriving, basically surviving the elements, surviving the social elements, surviving the physical elements, they were the more attractive mating partners. Because they were more successful, they were more attractive and enticing to mate with. So, as a function of natural selection, survival of the fittest, sexual selection comes into play. And those members of the species with the most attractive traits that lent themselves to the best survival of genes won out. And they were the ones who had the market cornered for mates. So through these two mechanisms, sexual selection and natural selection, the species would produce essentially three things, or that would produce three things in the species. The first is adaptations. The second is byproducts. And the third is noise. So on this screen is a description of adaptations. And those essentially refer to evolved strategies like traits, mechanisms, etc., that solved important survival or reproductive problems. For example, a trait for women could be that women should have wider hips to facilitate childbirth, right? So an adaptation is the width of a female's hips, because that has a direct influence and also implication for how well she would be able to have children. The second, byproducts. These are things that are associated with adaptations but are not in and of themselves adaptations. So these are characteristics that do not solve adaptive problems for survival or reproduction, but they are associated with those things. So for example, women with a higher hip to waist ratio are in higher demand as mates and are more attractive to men. And so sometimes you'll hear the phrase a Coke bottle shape. That is a way to describe a hip to waist ratio that's more curvaceous, such that there's wider set hips. So the width of the hips, while that's an adaptation, a Coke bottle shape, not so much. You could maybe say that's a byproduct. And then the third of the three, noise. Noise refers to random effects that occur when evolution produces random changes in design that have absolutely no adaptive function and aren't associated with adaptations. And I didn't have a good example here, so I just wrote high-heeled behavior. So. Next up, what are some common misunderstandings of this approach? As I mentioned, it's fraught with problems and shortcomings. It's retrospective, it's very speculative, it's very difficult to derive testable hypotheses from this theoretical approach. So it's harder to conduct the research, and the resources in terms of methodology and other resources can be tricky. But some of the other problems, there are a number of misunderstandings when you're talking about a biological influence on personality traits and mechanisms. One is that evolution does not imply genetic determinism, meaning while our ancestors may have needed to be conscientious in order to survive and thrive and procreate, present day, that doesn't mean everybody walking around is conscientious, right? So we vary to the extent to which we have or are conscientious, but it in and of itself was an adaptation. So it is not the case that evolution implies a one-to-one ratio of everyone having the same traits. It also does not imply that just because, say, your parents or a group of people's parents were pretty conscientious, that doesn't mean all of their children are going to be conscientious too. The second point, another misunderstanding is that behavior is set in stone and void of influence from the environment. We know that that is not true. There is definitely the influence of nature or biology on our traits and behaviors. There's also the influence of nurture or the environment on our traits and mechanisms and behaviors. Number 3, it is not the case that evolution, the process of evolution as described in Darwin's theory, it is not the case that the process of evolution is forward thinking or is, a conscious process. It's not a conscious, effortful, controlled process. It is something that is said to occur naturally and over a very long period of time, over a significant number of generations. So the development of these adaptations, it's not a conscious thing, it's not a willful thing, it's not a purposeful thing. It is a natural occurrence that evolves over time and over generations. And then the fourth, mechanisms are not necessarily optimally designed. Again, they occur as a natural function over time and across many generations. So because it's not a planned out, logical thing, it doesn't always end in the most idyllic way. Now, some of the other research that is referenced in your text Certainly, David Buss and his colleagues are heavily cited, and some of the research on temperament in children is cited in this notion that temperament is the precursor to personality traits like the big five: openness to stimuli, to new experiences, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. The precursors to those five traits are temperaments, things like activity level, emotionality, sociability, and impulsivity. There is evidence of those four among infants, and we see that in multiple studies that have looked at infants from multiple cultures on multiple continents. And those temperaments that you can see very quickly after birth, you can see evidence of, those are heavily, of course, influenced by genetics and biology. But they do continue to develop. Those temperaments do continue to develop. They are influenced by what the child experiences in his or her social environment and how the caregivers interact with the child to evolve and develop, if you will, into the big five. So there is some of that research cited in your chapter, and I do encourage you to read over that. I try not to make these recordings too long, so I'll have you read over that. And also this notion that there is a genetic influence on personality, as can be seen in the temperament literature, but also as can be seen in the Big Five literature that's employed twin studies. And so we see among those Big Five, the traits that have the highest levels of heritability or genetic influence actually turn out to be extroversion and neuroticism at a rate of about 0.5 and 0.54. And of course, there is also evidence to support the notion that while humans and persons, if you will, clearly demonstrate personality traits and mechanisms, they are not the only ones, living things that have traits and mechanisms. And so in your chapter, there is a review. I'm not sure why this extra bar is appearing on this slide, but let's see. That's a little bit better. So this table is in your textbook, and it essentially does a good job of summarizing some of the literature that has looked at these various animals to see if evidence of the big five can be found among them. And we see that there is a lot of support for the notion of personality in animals. And there's the greatest support and the greatest evidence of that among higher order primates like chimpanzees and orangutans too. So, okay, to recap, again, I'm trying to keep this shorter. We did talk a little bit about the life of David Buss and how coming from a certain background did lead him to focus his attention on the evolutionary influence or influences on personality and traits. So you notice he didn't study so much how poverty can influence or could influence the evolution of traits in different groups or on different continents, or how different environments, well, we saw how the life of David Buss influenced what he chose to ultimately study and how he ultimately chose to study it. You'll see in the lived experiences of other theorists that we will study how maybe coming from a more disadvantaged background or led them to study a different perspective and a different set of constructs. Then we talked about evolutionary theory, more broadly defined, followed by a focus of how it could be applied to specifically to the area of personality and that literature. And then we talked a little bit about some of the research that is cited in your text. I hope, as is always the case, that you will take the time to read on your own, take your own notes, and if you've listened to this lecture, I hope that you took notes as you went along and will take the opportunity to combine your notes and synthesize those. Because remember, there will be a cumulative final at the end of the semester. And if you already have your notes together, I think you'll find that you're in much better shape. All right. Thanks for listening, and I will end this video here.